Hey, this is John Fernay, the co-host of the Maryland Crabs, and I am here today with a Maryland Crabcake for your listening pleasure. What's a crab cake? It's not quite a full episode, it's just a little snippet. Stay tuned and check it out. And make sure you check us out on themarylandcrabs.com. You can follow us on Twitter at MD Crabs Podcast, or find us on Facebook at the Maryland Crabs Podcast. And don't forget, subscribe, rate us, iTunes. Go there now. Believe it or not, I'm sitting on the second floor of the Point Lighthouse, and on a bench underneath a beautiful window looking out at a beautiful sort of a gray bay day in the spring, and I'm with John Potvin, who is the Preservation Foreman for the US Lighthouse Society, in charge of the Point Lighthouse Restoration Project, which has been an ongoing labor of love for you, and I don't even want to venture to guess how many people are involved, both with the manual labor or the fundraising or everything else. But welcome, and hey, thank you very much for inviting me out here. We got a great ride out on a dead rise this morning with a group of carpenters that are from the Annapolis Woodworking Guild, who are volunteering their time every Friday to make sure this is up to speed and up to date.
Well, thank you, John. It's an exciting time for us. This is actually our 15th year anniversary for the lighthouse. It was purchased by the city of Annapolis and the Annapolis Maritime Museum in 2004.
I remember that. It was kind of a big thing, a neat thing, where they were able to get ownership of this icon of the bay. And it was funny, I was talking to somebody with Maryland Tourism who had said that when people think of Maryland and they've done their studies and whatnot, they immediately think of blue crabs, obviously so. And the other ones were the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, as well as the Point Lighthouse. Now, they may not have known where exactly the Point Lighthouse was in Maryland, whether it was Annapolis or someplace else, but the iconic screw pile lighthouse that sits about a mile and a half off of Thomas Point is just such an icon in the area, and you just can't get out on the bay without seeing a picture. I know on the ride over, you were showing me just a fantastic photograph that somebody had taken approaching the house. What are you guys doing here? I mean, I've been out here on the tour once or twice, and they are offered through the Annapolis Maritime Museum on a limited basis. And it's like June through August or September, and it's like maybe 1 or 2 weekends a month.
Yeah, we basically have a schedule. You can find it at the Maritime Museum's website, the Annapolis Maritime Museum. Just Google that, and it will have a schedule. We also have a schedule at the US Lighthouse Society website, which is uslighthousesociety.org, uslhs.org. And we are actively working to preserve this lighthouse. A lot of work has been done. In fact, I've got to tell you, I'm humbled by the work I've seen out here over the years. 15 years worth of work has brought this lighthouse back to supreme condition. We're about 85% done with our renovation, but with a wood structure in the middle of the bay, with salt water.
What could possibly go wrong?
Well, what could go wrong? There's always going to be something that we have to attend to. In fact, back in the day, when the lighthouse was run by the United States Lighthouse Service, they were constantly painting and cleaning brass and doing what have you to maintain it. So our goal here is to preserve this lighthouse for posterity, where our children, our grandchildren, or our great-grandchildren can come out and visit this wonderful facility. Renovations have included completely getting rid of lead paint in the interior, or encapsulating the interior, new wood walls, new wood ceilings in several areas, repainting the entire inside, getting rid of all the rotten wood on the outside. The Woodworkers Guild have been wonderful for us. They've, over the last 2 years, replaced about 75% of the outside siding. And on the inside, we are just about to refinish the floor on the second deck, which is where we are now, to bring the wood floors back. Because at one point they had orange carpet tile on them and pea green walls.
That sounds like solid 1970s to
Absolutely.
me.
Absolutely.
Well, give us, here we are in 2019, give us a little bit of a history, if you can, of this light. How did it come to be here, and what is its use? And one of the unique things about the Thomas Point Shoal is it is the only screw pile lighthouse, and then you can probably expand on that a little bit, that's still in continuous navigational use. It is a navigational aid for boats that are coming up the bay now. It's not obviously it is a little bit of a tourist attraction, but it is a working lighthouse.
It certainly is. The Coast Guard has an easement with the lighthouse since they sold it to the city of Annapolis and the Annapolis Maritime Museum. The United States Lighthouse Society has a 99-year lease to maintain the lighthouse. But this lighthouse was actually built in 1875. So the screw pile concept was to build a lighthouse that in a kit form in Baltimore and bring it by barge out on top of a platform of screw piles that are put in the bottom of the bay. They actually had 40 or more of these lighthouses at one time in the bay. A lot of the lighthouses have since washed away or been dismantled, and several of the lighthouses are actively in museums right now, one in Baltimore, Maryland, downtown, one in St. Michael's at the Maritime Marine Museum, and then one in Solomon's at the Maritime Marine Museum. So these lighthouses are iconic. They are very unusual. They have cast iron knuckles that are screwed into the bay, followed by a series of steel beams that surrounds the lower portion, and the cottage-style lighthouse is put on top of that.
And a screw pile is a rod that goes down into the bay, and there's an auger, if you will, on the bottom of that is screwed down into the mud. The bay is basically a pretty soft bottom.
It is a soft bottom, so it's an auger that goes down with about a 2-foot blade at the very bottom that is actually screwed like a screw into the bottom of the bay. It goes down 20 feet, and then it comes above the water about 12 feet to the structure itself.
Okay, and then it's all sort of held together by tie rods and iron rods that...
Yes, well, actually steel beams and tie rods that protect it from wind and weather, because you can imagine a cottage like this in the middle of the bay is going to get buffeted by waves and weather on a regular basis. So it has to stand the test of time.
Are the screw pile lighthouses unique to the Chesapeake Bay area?
No, there are screw pile lighthouses in other locations, but they're better suited to a bay use than an ocean use, because the ocean use typically is much more severe.
I would think so. Now, okay, so you said that this was the US Lighthouse Society is where you're with, but it was the US Lighthouse Service.
No, originally the lighthouse was run by the United States Lighthouse Service, which was a separate, distinct entity. In 1939, the United States Lighthouse Service was joined with the Coast Guard. So at that point, the Coast Guard took over the management of all lighthouses, including the personnel that came out to the lighthouses.
Okay, so prior to that, navigation was a separate entity with the Lighthouse Service.
Yes.
And the Coast Guard gave us protection of the coast,
correct,
if you will, the defending our shorelines. And now they've taken upon navigation as well?
Well, they had in 1939,
okay,
but this lighthouse was actually automated in 1986. So the Coast Guard turned the keys over in 1986 to a group that rarely came out here. Everything was automated. It was a cost-saving measure by the Coast Guard, and they felt that it was the right thing to be doing, because ship traffic today is governed by GPSs and bay pilots and what have you. So the idea behind a navigational device in the middle of the bay is less important now than it was in the past. If you can imagine days before the RAN or GPSs, I'm dating myself a little bit here.
Yeah.
Ships were basically totally reliant on buoys and markers throughout the bay. And that's what the lighthouse system was all about, was providing markers and buoys throughout the bay to get you clearly up to Baltimore Harbor and beyond.
So is a lighthouse, is Thomas Point Lighthouse an effective navigation aid for ships that are coming up the bay, or not really at this point?
It's not effective for ships coming up the bay, but for the average sailor, who by their very nature typically don't have a lot of instruments on their boats, they still rely on the lighthouse.
Okay.
To get in and out of the South River or the West River, or stay off the shoal at Thomas Point Lighthouse.
Right.
It's Thomas Point Shoal.
Well, okay, so the Coast Guard maintained it, and let's talk a little bit about what happened when the Lighthouse Society or the Lighthouse Service had it. There was somebody that actually lived here. I mean, we didn't have electricity. We didn't have, any of the. I wouldn't say there's no comforts really here anyway, but you didn't have any comforts of home. But there was somebody here manning this, right?
It was a Spartan living. I will tell you, it was a Spartan living. And they couldn't have their families living on the lighthouses after about 1779, or 1879, sorry. But it was a Spartan experience for them. They had basically cots for beds. They had no power. They had kerosene lamps. The light that lights the lighthouse up is a kerosene lamp, or was at that time. It wasn't until 1939 that power was actually brought out to the lighthouse. And it was a boring detail for the keepers. The keepers would typically have to keep logs of ship traffic, keep logs of the maintenance on the lighthouse, keep logs of how often they're replacing the oil in their kerosene lamps. Everything was a very monotonous experience, to the extent that at one point, one of the assistant keepers went missing and actually committed suicide by jumping off the lighthouse. So it happens.
Well, how long were they out here for?
Typically, they're out here for 6 months at a time. They had a boat so they could go ashore for supplies, but they were expected to be out here for 6 months at a time. And they'd have a 6-month relief who would come out here. In some cases, they refused to have the relief. They would stay out here all the time.
Okay, so they could
Great escape, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so they could go ashore for a couple hours to get supplies, probably once a week or so. Because I mean, it's we're a mile and a half out. I mean, it's probably not as easy to get to shore then as it was getting out here today. I mean, we didn't have we had the boat to take us out here fairly quickly. And Coast Guard took over, and you said in the 30s,
1939.
And was that manned at this point?
It was manned. They had 4 coasties out here typically. Excuse me. They had.
They were the ones that drew the short straw, right?
They drew actually, they were going from lighthouse to lighthouse. They loved that duty because it was very different. They actually could sit here in a radio room and watch TV. You can't do that on shore. They were their own bosses to a large extent, so they had a great time out here. They typically had 4 coasties at the lighthouse at any given point in time. They had 6-hour shifts, so they were on 6 hours, off 6 hours, and they would always have 2 on shift.
Okay, so that was fairly easy. And get to shore, you can go out and have a beer at night and come on back the next day and do your 6-hour shift. So that's pretty neat. So where are we here now? Okay, with this place, when you took this over, and I say you, and that's the US Lighthouse Society, the Annapolis Maritime Museum in the city of Annapolis, this thing was beat up.
It was in very rough shape. The Coast Guard had given it to us with some serious issues on the inside. We had some rotting wood on the outside. We had lead paint on the inside. All of the furnishings had been removed. The rooms were in disarray. The floors were in disarray. So we started a methodical process over the last 15 years of going room by room and trying to restore each one to different levels. I showed you today the reception room as an example, the parlor, which is pre-1939 conditions. The kitchen is pre-1939 conditions.
Right.
By that, what I mean is that the Coast Guard has a whole different color scheme, as an example, for their paints than before with the United States Lighthouse Service. So we're trying to restore elements of the pre-1939 and elements of the Coast Guard era.
That's what I was going to ask you. So it's not necessarily when this will be finally done, which probably will be never, will probably long live us because it's a wooden structure in the middle of the bay, but it is going to represent the different eras that the lighthouse existed. It's not necessarily all pre-1939 U.S. Lighthouse Service or Coast Guard service.
Exactly. And there are artifacts here that are pre-1939 artifacts, and then there are artifacts from when the Coast Guard manned the lighthouse. We have highly qualified, trained docents that bring the tours out. Typically 2 docents per tour go through and teach everybody about what the history of the lighthouse is and what we're undergoing with the renovation. So they get to see it. This is what I would call an adventure tour.
Sure.
It's an adventure tour in that, we can't have children under the age of 12 because we can't accommodate them. We have...
obviously, it's not handicap accessible.
It's not handicap accessible. They have a series of steps they have to get up to just get on the lighthouse.
Right.
And then once in the lighthouse, we have a circular step that they have to get up to the second deck.
There's ladders. And
it's a challenge. Yeah. But it's an adventure tour, and it's very worthwhile because they get a sense of what it would have been like to live out here in the middle of the bay, 1.5 miles offshore. We do this typically in rain or shine. So there are conditions where we'll come out here and it's rainy and crappy, and
it's just like it was way back when.
Right, exactly.
Well, I will say, and I have done the tour, and I've said that this a lot of people will see the tour and they'll get shell shocked because they're used to the 1999 tour on the Harbor Queen or something like that, and they see an $80 price tag on this. And the only advice I can give to anybody that's considering that is it is worth every penny and then some. And I would consider giving and then some, donating on when you get back to the Annapolis Maritime Museum. It is about a 2.5-hour tour or something by the time you've done, I think.
It takes a half an hour for the Sharps Island, which is a boat, the Sharps Island boat, to bring the visitors out. and then it's about an hour and a half to 2 hour tour on the lighthouse, and another half an hour back in. So it can be a 2.5 hour to 3 hours.
And you get into the lighthouse, you can see the different levels that they're living in. I know in the past they've been able to let us peek up into the lens room, for lack of a better word, but the very tippy top where the Fresnel lens is, and it's actually rotating, and the history behind it is absolutely fascinating, and it's been a eye-opener to come in here and see the process that you guys have made. Where do you need to go from here? I mean, what's the need now to bring this?
John, that's
15%.
a great question. That's a great question, because we are at a juncture now where we've done 85% of the structure. Mostly what we're doing now is maintaining. Although you can hear the saws in the background, yeah. There's a little bit of woodwork going on right now, which is exciting for us. But we also have a structure here that is made of steel. And while the screw piles themselves, and we've had divers go down and look at the screw piles, are in perfect condition, almost as good a condition as if they were to put in. The steel structure that goes from those knuckles that is supporting the lighthouse itself is in poor condition and needs to be replaced. We are fortunate in that we've gotten some seed money from the state of Maryland. The Maryland Historic Trust has given us a grant to start a process of replacing the beams and the tie rods. There are 6 steel beams out here, and then 12 tie rods that all need to be replaced. And we'd really like to be able to do that all in one shot. Right now we can't afford to do that.
Sure.
So we've gotten some funding from a group called the Davidsonville Ruritan Club, which are affiliated with our woodworkers here. They sought out those funds, and we were successful in getting a large donation from them. The Annapolis Yacht Club is considering a donation right now. We have a number of local builders who are considering giving us some donations. But we're far short of what we need to do to really get this structure replaced in 1 year. We can do it over time. It certainly can be done that way. But the economy of scale is to try and get it done all at one time, because the staging is the largest exposure in trying to replace these beams.
Sure, you can't bring out a barge and set up to replace one beam and then do it 6 months later again for the same thing. And, for those that are trying to picture it, I mean, you've got the screw piles which go underneath the water, and then we'll say above the surface of the water is this sort of web of steel beams that hold all these screw piles together. And then from there it goes up into these tie rods, which actually hold the wooden structure and the decking and whatnot above it. But that lower level, the foundation, I guess it's the basement of a typical house of the Thomas Point Lighthouse, is exposed 24/7 to the elements, the hot, the cold, the wet, the salt water. I'm sure there's acidity and all the bird poop that's on there and whatnot. But this has been around forever, and you can see as we came up, you can see that they are deteriorating. I mean, it's not to the point where falling into the bay is imminent or anything, but it's no easy task to swap these out. And if you come out here, you'll be able to see that, and that's a huge need. And I think that once you get that done, that's going to give you the foundation to make sure that this is here, as you said, for your children and your grandchildren and their children to do that. The woodworkers, the Annapolis Woodworking Guild, they're working on the exterior of the building, and I've got to imagine that's very much like the old joke painting a bridge. So you get to one side and then you turn around and do the other. I mean, we're here on an octagonal?
It's octagonal.
Okay, so we're on an 8-sided lighthouse. I imagine once you get around that circle, you're about ready to start on it again.
Well, I think that the woodworkers are really committed to continuing to get as much done as possible. I just took a moisture meter reading, for instance, on some of the wood, and while we think that we want to have the wood...
By the way, I was looking at you bringing that out on the way over there. I said, okay, I know I've been scammed, man. The guy's going to tase me here in the middle of he's going to tase me in the middle of the day.
It does look like a taser, you're right. But I wanted to see exactly how much moisture we are dealing with that's under the surface of the existing wood, because that will dictate where we go next with the renovation on the outside. And frankly, it's going to be an ongoing process. I don't think that there will ever be a day where we aren't looking at some sort of wood replacement on the outside of the lighthouse.
Well, again, you've got, when it was constructed, obviously it was constructed at one time by new materials, and it was all pieced together. The puzzle was pieced together and assembled out here. Now, at this point, something on the north side may wear a little bit differently than on the south or the east and whatnot. And I've seen some of the pictures, and what they're doing is, I mean, they're finding rotted pieces of wood that they're carving out.
Well, and this is Spanish cedar. This lighthouse is made out of Spanish cedar, which is fairly rare. and we're replacing it with Spanish cedar. And a lot of the wood has to be custom milled. They have a shop up in Glen Burnie that is custom milling the wood because it's all unusual sizes. Back in the day when they built this lighthouse, wood was milled very differently than it is today. For instance, a 2x4 in the day was a real 2x4. Today it's not. So
that's true. I never thought.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to make sure you get the pieces that fit what you're taking out to go back in. So it's been for the woodworkers, it's been a labor of love because this is the stuff they just love to do.
Well, and just to give you an idea, you said that they put in about 2,000 hours a year.
2,000 hours of volunteer time. This is volunteer time, so they put in that much time.
So the payroll is not over the top here.
Well, as I say, my Preservation Foreman title sounds great, but my salary was doubled when I got that from 0 to 00. So I make a lot of money as a volunteer out here, but it's very rewarding for us. And the countless number of volunteers that have been out here and have dug into this thing and done what they've done, it just makes me very proud to be affiliated with the US Lighthouse Society and with the Annapolis Maritime Museum, and doing this kind of stuff on an ongoing basis, I think, is really beneficial for everybody.
But I think it's interesting that Annapolis is often said, and I think I've got the right century, but it is the one city in America that has more 18th century intact historic buildings than any other town in America. And I certainly think that as we look at the Thomas Point Lighthouse, which is also one of those, it is the last remaining intact, in operation screw pile lighthouse in existence. In existence? Am I right there?
That's in existence in its original location.
Right. You mentioned me earlier that this was not where it was originally built.
Originally, there was a lighthouse on Thomas Point. Actually, there was a piece of land called Thomas Point that no longer exists. There was a 30-foot tall caisson lighthouse on shore. The problem is that...
And what's a caisson lighthouse?
Caisson lighthouse is basically a stone lighthouse or a round lighthouse that's made tall by virtue of the fact that it's cone-shaped.
Okay.
So it gives itself its...
Is Hatteras the Hatteras light? Which
Hatteras light is a caisson light. Right? Okay. So there was a caisson light on shore, and two problems with that. Number one, the shore was eroding constantly. And that's been stabilized at Thomas Point, by the way. They put rock around Thomas Point, so that's stabilized. But there was a very large piece of land that is now gone at the entrance to Fishing Creek. So the caisson light was eroding, and the mariners complained about it because it was sitting on shore, whereas the shoal goes out 1.5 miles. People were still running aground. So they finally decided to put a lighthouse at the edge of the shoal where people were actually hitting bottom. But there is one other aspect that I want to make sure that we get across to the public, and that is that we've got a city of 40,000 people or more, and then in Anne Arundel County a very large population that all know Thomas Point. They all care for this lighthouse. It's an icon for all of us, and we want to maintain that. So we have established a GoFundMe site to try to see if we can get people to help us defray the cost of getting these steel beams replaced.
And the beautiful thing about a GoFundMe site is that you can donate $10,000 or you can donate $2.
It doesn't matter how much, they're matched. We have an independent donor who's matching really cool. those funds. So if somebody puts $2 in, it's worth $4. If somebody puts in $10,000, it's worth $20,000. We have a benefactor that is matching every single dollar that's put in to the GoFundMe site.
That's phenomenal. And I'll make sure that we put that into the show notes so people can click on that. And, again, if you can support this effort of love, which is what is, and nobody gets paid. I mean, the docents aren't being paid that are bringing out the tours. The people that are certainly maintaining this, and you've had some challenges in your maintenance. And obviously, you've got an old structure that you've got to restore. Is the biggest challenge. But a couple of years ago, you had some, pardon my language, but some jackasses that broke into here in the middle of the night.
It was a shame. We had some vandalism. They kicked out many of the pickets that are surrounding the railings on the lighthouse. They took a battery and threw it through the glass at the lantern level and broke the glass. They shot fire extinguishers all over the inside of the lighthouse. They threw a TV out on the rocks, which we were able to salvage. But we had tours 2 weeks later, and we were able to put the lighthouse back into reasonable condition within 2 weeks of that vandalism. So to that extent, we've now put in a camera system. We have a camera that feeds into my phone and the Vice President of the Lighthouse Society's phone, so that if somebody does come out here untoward trying to do something, we can contact the Coast Guard. They're 5 minutes away. They're very responsive.
And they've got guns.
Big ones, big guns in the front of their boats.
But yeah, no, I mean, by vandalism as a crime, I don't understand at all, and I think that when you've got a national treasure, and I mean, is this on the national?
It is on the National Historic
Registry.
Registry, and it is the top-rated National Historic Registry list. This is not the register as much as the list, the top list.
Okay.
There's only 10 other lighthouses in the country that are on this list.
I'm going to say the Hatteras Lighthouse is probably the one.
Hatteras is, and I know there's several on the West Coast too.
Yeah, I'm thinking the one down in St. Augustine might be too as well. I know that's a fairly old one. That's
I'll have to Google that.
Down there in Florida. Come out and support the lighthouse. I will put the link for the GoFundMe in the show notes. We'll put that in the different articles. I would like to sort of roam around here and get a bunch more pictures of the work that the Annapolis Woodworkers Guild is doing. A great bunch of guys that came out on the boat this morning, along with John Potvin, who is the Preservation Foreman for the US Lighthouse Society. And I understand you're under training to be a docent too.
Actually, John, I am training to be a docent. I've learned so much here at the Lighthouse, I thought maybe I should know what they are going to talk about when they go to the Lighthouse, so when I bring other people out here, I can tell them a little bit more about it.
One thing I'll say in Annapolis tours, and we'll talk to the watermark tours, or whether it's the walking tours for history, or the architects tours, or the Thomas Point Lighthouse tour. Anytime you go out on what people would consider a touristy tour or something like that, I, as a local, always learn something new and something absolutely fascinating. I know I have this morning when I'm out here with you guys, just to see how things work. The icebreakers. I didn't realize why we needed to have riprap, because the icebreaker wasn't working when the ice flowed. I didn't know that ice flowed down bay and not up bay. And it's just fascinating to get a piece of the history that we probably aren't taught about too much anymore.
Well, and interestingly, every docent has a little bit different nature, so you learn something from every single docent. So if you took a trip out here 2 years ago, you should come back, because what you're going to find is that people know more today than they knew 2 years ago, and everybody has a little different personality of what they talk about. I showed you as an example the initials on the rocks.
Right.
Out at the lighthouse, most people don't even look at the rocks, but there are initials on the rocks from the original lighthouse keepers going back to 1875, and a lot of the coasties went out there and wrote their dates of service on the rocks.
And I looked out there, and I think I had noticed them in the past, and as I told you, I said I thought that was just like graffiti from kids tying up a boat and climbing on there, fishing for a rock or something like that.
Yeah, no.
Which is fantastic. And as you said, with the different perspectives, I imagine when you're docenting, I don't know if that's the proper term, but you're probably going to have a little bit more of a focus on the reconstruction efforts and the woodworking and whatnot, because obviously you're involved with that an awful lot. And I think somebody else may be, I'll throw my sexist thing out here, maybe a woman docent, a female docent may have a little bit more of a maternal kind of like, here's what the life was like, here's how they had to cook, here's how they had to live in a little different aspect. So it's a lot of history. We don't get a chance to see it that often, even more rarely, to touch it, to walk around it, to climb up the ladders. And again, as John has said, that it's not for the
faint of heart.
Yeah. I mean, you're getting off of a bouncing boat onto a dock, and then you're going up not a standard little staircase, and then there's a little bit of a ladder to get to a thing, and the spiral staircase. But it is a work of art that we've got here, 1.5 miles off of Thomas Point, just outside of Annapolis. You can find out more information at uslhs.org and Annapolis Maritime Museum, which would be amaritime.org. If you have a chance to get a tour, they are only offered during the summer because the winter can be pretty brutal out here, and you can get an idea of what it would be like for somebody that was living here for 6 months at a time. And find out how a Coast Guardman and a light keeper lived pretty darn
144 years ago.
John, thank you very much for inviting me out. I encourage everybody to donate to this, and even if it is just a little bit. And if the guys and gals that vandalize this are listening to this, you especially should donate.
Well, John, thank you very much for telling our story. It is a great facility, and it is a great tour. It's not a tourism tour. It's something locals should do. So thank you so much.
Without a doubt. I mean, this is something that I would say every local, but most locals have been out on the bay at some point in some fashion and have seen this outside of a postcard. And this is an opportunity not to get up close and look at it and listen about it. This is get in it, climb in it, crawl in it, see what it is. You can touch the wood, you can smell the wood, you can smell the crabs that the osprey were feasting on.
You can smell the seagulls.
But again, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to go grab some pictures of this and see if we get some more people out here and donate to the fund and help keep this preservation going.
Thanks so much, John.
This has been the Maryland Crabs Podcast with Tim Hamilton and John Fernay. Sure to follow them at all the regular places, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and online at themarylandcrabs.com. Take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Now, get the hell out of my kitchen. Seriously, go!
You're still here? It's over. Go home.